This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this talk we're going to begin the study of The Art of Rhetoric by Aristotle in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Classical Rhetoric course. In this talk we'll be reading Chapter 1 of Book 1, and the purpose of this talk is not to provide the student with a complete study of the chapter. That's going to be pursued by the student as he studies for mastery. But this talk is simply intended to help a student through his first reading, which sometimes is the most difficult part of the study, to try to explain some things that might cause students to have some trouble and try to prevent those troubles. This is called a prelection in teaching, and the goal is to help a student study for mastery as efficiently as possible. So let's walk through Chapter 1 together of Book 1 of Aristotle's Art of Rhetoric. We read, "Rhetoric reciprocates with dialectic." Rhetoric reciprocates with dialectic. These two terms, rhetoric and dialectic, are very important. In Taylor's translation, if you read along, you'll see that in brackets, Taylor says that dialectic is just another name for logic. This can be a little confusing because it's a bit more complicated than that. As we study Aristotle's reasoning, we're going to see that there are two kinds of reasoning. There's demonstrative reasoning and dialectical reasoning. When we talk about logic, we usually talk about both of these kinds of reasoning, demonstrative and dialectical. In the different courses of classical reasoning, we'll study these different kinds of reasoning. So it's important to understand that when Aristotle says rhetoric reciprocates with dialectic, he's likely referring to dialectical reasoning, which we study in his book called The Topics. So just try to keep that in mind as you read this, that dialectic can't be thought of as being equivalent to or having the same meaning as logic. Logic is too broad. What we should understand is that Aristotle opens this book by saying rhetoric reciprocates with dialectical reasoning. And we'll understand that more as we study both rhetoric and classical reasoning together. So rhetoric reciprocates with dialectic, for both are conversant with such particular things as being common may after a manner be known by all men and pertain to no definite science. So Aristotle explains that rhetoric and dialectic have this relationship. They're both general sciences. They're sciences that apply to all sciences underneath them. They're not specific sciences that just focus on one specific subject of knowledge or investigation, but they're general sciences, or general arts, we should say. And that's what makes them so valuable. The reason why rhetoric and dialectic are included in the three arts of the trivium is because they really are the most important general arts that, once we've mastered them, allow us to enter into all of the other sciences, all the philosophical sciences, mathematical sciences, and so on, even theology. So rhetoric and dialectic have this in common, that they may be known by all men, and they pertain to no definite science. They are general studies. Hence, all men, in a certain respect, participate of both these. For all men, to a certain extent, endeavor to examine and sustain an argument. We all have to do that. To defend and accuse. We all have to do that. So these are skills that are simply human. It's normal stuff that human beings have to do. And these arts, rhetoric and dialectic, teach us how to do them. Therefore, they pertain to all men. With respect to the multitude, some men do these things casually or by chance. That's what casually means here. It means by chance. Some men do these things by chance. Others do them through custom and habit. Because this is possible in both ways, it's evident that these particulars may also be reduced to a certain method or art. So Aristotle is explaining that if these things like making a good argument or defending someone against an accusation, if those things were just done randomly with success by random people, or if there were just some certain people who were really good at them and no one could explain why they were good, there would be no art to be able to study and learn these skills ourselves. They wouldn't pertain to all men. But what we find, Aristotle says, is there are some people who do these things by chance, but there are others who do them by education and practice. And since both ways are possible, they're not just by chance, but they're also possible through study and practice, we can reduce the principles of these two sciences to a certain method. That is, a method or art that we can study and practice and teach to others. For it is possible to survey the cause why some men render what they assert probable from custom and others from chance. But all men now will acknowledge that a thing of this kind is the work of art. It's not just chance, not just luck, not just talent, but these skills are works of art. And that's why we call these the arts of rhetoric and dialectic. Aristotle goes on and says, at present, those who compose, and remember when Aristotle says at present, he's talking about in his generation, so in the 4th century before Christ. In his time, before he wrote the art of rhetoric, those who composed the arts of orations explain only a small part of the art of rhetoric. For credibility is the only artificial part of the art, but the other parts are additions. So Aristotle criticizes the men who had attempted to teach the art of rhetoric before him, because he said all they try to do is help people make eloquent orations. They help people with public speaking. But this is not what rhetoric really is. They don't even cover the most important subject. And Aristotle says the most important subject is credibility. Credibility is the only artificial part of the art. Now, when you hear the word artificial, you might think it means fake. Like if I say, this man has an artificial leg, we say that to mean fake. It's a fake leg. But here, what the meaning really is it's something that's done by art, something that's made by man. So an artificial leg is really not a fake leg. It's a leg that's made by man, a leg made with hands, to use a biblical phrase. So when Aristotle looks at the art of rhetoric, he says, the only part of the art of rhetoric that is really artificial, that really requires skill, that man can actually do, is credibility. Credibility is what man needs to concentrate on when he considers this art of rhetoric. All the other stuff, all the other tips and tricks of public speaking, that's really not the art of rhetoric. The art of rhetoric really has as its focus credibility. And we'll learn more about that as we go on. He says the rhetoricians of the present day, of his day, they say nothing about enthymemes, which are the substantial part of credibility. Enthymemes are rhetorical syllogisms. We'll learn more about this in this work, so just keep note of these new vocabulary items that come up, these technical terms, because Aristotle's a master teacher. He's not going to mention anything that he doesn't explain in detail later. So he says the rhetoricians of his day say nothing about enthymemes, which are the substantial part of credibility. But their attention is for the most part directed to things that are foreign to the purpose. For things like accusation, pity, anger, and such like passions of the soul do not pertain to the thing itself, but to the judge. Hence, if all judicial processes were conducted in the same manner as they are at present in some cities, and especially in those that are governed by good laws, these rhetoricians would not have anything to say. In other words, in countries that have good laws where their courts are run strictly in an orderly way, these goofy rhetoricians with all of their emotional appeals and fancy talk, they wouldn't even be allowed to practice this theatrical display of public speaking that they teach to their students. For with respect to all cities, some think it is necessary that the laws should thus ordain. But this method is adopted by others, and they forbid rhetoricians to say anything foreign to the purpose, in the same manner as in the Areopagus. So in well-ordered states, in well-ordered courts, men are not allowed to speak and introduce anything that does not directly relate to the case. And we see this in modern court cases. If you ever watch a modern court case in America, you'll see that if one of the lawyers starts to go off onto a subject that really doesn't relate directly to the case, the other lawyer will object and ask for the judge to interrupt and not allow the lawyer to continue talking about something that doesn't directly apply to the case. So in our state, we tend to be used to this because we do have good laws and good courts. In some places, it would have been a circus where all kinds of stuff could be pulled off by the men speaking, by the orators. Aristotle says, in this respect, they think rightly, these men of other cities. For it is not proper, it is not right to pervert the judge. It's not right to mislead the judge by exciting him to anger or to envy or to pity by playing with the judge's emotions. That's not right. Since this is just as if someone should make the rule distorted, which he intends to use. We don't want to distort or pervert or corrupt the judge. The judge is supposed to represent the law. But that's what these men do. Notice here that Aristotle, when it comes to the art of rhetoric, Aristotle is morally upright. He doesn't believe that rhetoric should be used as a way to manipulate people. He simply will teach us that rhetoric is the art by which we defend the truth to the best of our ability. So he says it's not proper to pervert the judge because this is like bending or twisting a ruler that you intend to use to measure something or to draw a straight line. That doesn't make any sense. Again, it is likewise manifest that the only business of the litigant, that would be the attorney or person speaking in a court case, the only business of the litigant is to show that a thing either is or is not, or that it has or has not been done. But with respect to such things as the legislator is a lawmaker, but with respect to such things as the legislator has not defined, whether they are great or small, just or unjust, these ought to be known by the judge himself, and he is not to learn them from the litigants. So Aristotle reveals here that the lawmakers are supposed to think about all of the different situations and circumstances, and they're to speak on all of these different situations in the law when they actually make the laws. They're to try and leave as little in the hands of judges as possible. And the judge is really only necessary where the law doesn't already speak on the issue, and the judge has to make a judgment in the specific case that's before him. But this can all be avoided if the lawmakers do a good job at making the laws. Aristotle concludes there in that last sentence by saying, the judge is not to learn these things from the litigants. In other words, the judge is not to go into the court allowing himself to be instructed or informed by the attorneys who are speaking. He's there to judge, not to be taught by the attorneys. It is especially requisite, therefore, that the laws which are rightly framed should define all such particulars as can be defined, and leave very little to be defined by the judge. And in the first place, indeed, this is requisite or necessary because it is more easy to find one person, or a few, than many who are intelligent and wise, and who are able to act the part of a legislator and a judge. In other words, to make a law, we only need one person, and one wise person can make all the laws for a state. And so the whole state can benefit by just one wise lawmaker. But because the courts are many, we would need to have many wise judges to make wise judgments, and that's not possible. So we don't want to allow judges to make the decisions. We want the lawmakers to make the decisions because we're likely only going to find one or a few wise people, and we want those people to make the law. A good example of this is in the history of the Jewish people. Moses gave Israel the whole law. Of course, Moses received the law from God himself, but we see this model that Aristotle's talking about in the history of the people of Israel. They had one lawgiver, Moses, and then they had many judges. And the law of Moses was so detailed, and some people might complain that there are so many laws in the Old Testament. Why are there so many laws? This is why there are so many laws. Because laws written by wise men take power out of the hands of judges. And as Aristotle explains here, that's the mark of a good state. Aristotle then goes on to say, in the next place, the establishment of laws is the effect of a survey from a long series of past time. But judgments are the result of a survey from recent times, so that it is difficult for those who judge to attribute what is just and advantageous in a becoming manner. It's difficult for judges to make righteous judgments because, first of all, they have to make a judgment on the spot. They've got to make a judgment sometimes in confusing or dangerous circumstances. And because of that, judges can be influenced by their own fears or weaknesses or misunderstandings. Lawmakers, on the other hand, are able to take their time, study past cases, study history, deliberate on all the different issues, and simply publish the laws under no pressure, under no emotional pressure, under no fear or intimidation or anything like that. And therefore, laws are a safer guide to a country than judges. Aristotle goes on and says, That, however, which is the greatest reason of all, is that the judgment of the legislator, the judgment of the lawmaker, is not conversant with particulars, but with future events and universals. But the judgment of the barrister and the judge is directed to present and definite circumstances. And with present and definite circumstances, love and hatred and private advantage are frequently conjoined or connected or entangled with, so that they are no longer sufficiently able to survey the truth, but their own peculiar pleasure or pain darkens their judgment. So when a lawmaker makes laws, he's writing laws for future events. He's not wrapped up emotionally in these things. He can think about what might take place in the future and, with a detached spirit, make laws that are good for the future. But a judge is living in the midst of the society that he's being asked to make judgments in. And his own emotions, his own concerns about his own life and welfare, or his own prosperity may all get involved in his ability to make a good judgment, and that can pervert justice. With respect to other particulars, it is necessary, as we have said, that very little should be left in the power of the judge. But with respect to the enquiry whether a thing has been done or not, or whether it will or will not take place, or is not, it is necessary that this should be left to the judges. For it is not possible that these things should be foreseen by the legislator. The legislator can't foresee the details of a particular case. He can't foresee the evidence that's present in a particular case. Only a present judge can know the details of a specific case and see the actual evidence. And therefore, only the judge who is actually presiding over the court during the trial can make a judgment as to whether or not this or that was actually done, and whether the things which are prohibited by the law have actually been committed by the people being accused. That's the work of a judge, Aristotle says, and it's all based on evidence. He goes on to say, if then this be the case, it is evident that those rhetoricians who define other parts of an oration, other parts of a speech, accept credibility, such, for instance, as what the proem, the introduction, or the narration should contain, and each of the other parts, these rhetoricians, these teachers exercise their art in things that are foreign to the purpose. These really don't have anything to do with the art of rhetoric. For in these, they effect nothing else except delivering the method by which the judge may be influenced. But they demonstrate nothing respecting artificial credibility, which is the actual skill that's sought through the study and practice of the art of rhetoric, credibility. Namely, whence or from where someone may become enthematic. And again, this is a technical term that Aristotle is introducing in the book of Rhetoric here, so we're going to learn more about this in the future. They demonstrate nothing respecting artificial credibility, namely, whence someone may become enthematic, or possess the power of discovering artificial proofs of that which is the subject of controversy. So we can see what Aristotle means by artificial credibility is the ability to discover proofs or arguments, the ability to discover proofs related to the subject that's being argued. the ability to invent lines of argument or discover proofs. That's what we mean by artificial credibility. Hence, though there is the same method respecting popular and judicial orations, speeches made in the presence of a judge, or public speeches made in the presence of the people, though there is the same method respecting popular and judicial orations, and the popular is better and more political than the method pertaining to contracts, yet rhetoricians of Aristotle's day are silent as to the popular method, but all of them endeavor to unfold the art pertaining to the judicial class of speeches, because it is less advantageous in popular orations to assert what is foreign to the purpose. And a popular oration is less pernicious than a judicial discussion, but is more common. For in the former, the judge decides about appropriate concerns, so that nothing else is necessary than to show that the thing is as the counselor asserts it to be. In judicial processes, however, this is not sufficient, but it is requisite to pay attention to the hearer, for the decision is concerning things of a foreign nature. Hence the judges, looking to their own advantage and regarding their own pleasure, gratify or please the litigants, that is, the people speaking in court. The judges, looking to their own advantage and regarding or thinking about their own pleasure, seek to please those speaking in the courts. But they do not decide with justice. Hence, too, Aristotle says, as I have before observed, in many places the law forbids anything foreign to the purpose to be said, and in these places this law is sufficiently observed by the judges themselves. Since, however, it is evident that the artificial method is conversant with credibility, and that's a really important sentence to pay attention to. It is evident that the artificial method, the real art and skill of rhetoric, is conversant with credibility, that is, the ability to discover proofs. He then says, credibility is a certain demonstration, a certain kind of proof. For we then especially believe in a thing when we think it is accompanied with demonstration. And a rhetorical demonstration is an enthymeme. So here we have the definition of an enthymeme, as I mentioned before. An enthymeme is a rhetorical demonstration. So we're going to learn about proofs, different kinds of arguments in classical reasoning. And in rhetoric, we're going to talk about what are called rhetorical demonstrations. And the technical term for rhetorical demonstrations is enthymeme. Aristotle says, this, in short, possesses the greatest authority of all credibilities. But an enthymeme is a certain syllogism, and it is the province either of the whole or of a certain part of dialectic to pay attention similarly to every syllogism. A syllogism is simply a logical argument. This being the case, it is evident that he who is eminently capable of surveying this, namely, from what propositions and how a syllogism may be made, he will be especially enthymematic, in consequence of assuming what the particulars are with which enthymemes are conversant, and what differences they possess with respect to logical syllogisms. For it is the province of the same power to perceive truth and what is similar to truth. And at the same time, men are by nature sufficiently adapted to the perception of the truth, and for the most part, obtain it. Hence, he who sagaciously conjectures probabilities is disposed similarly to him who perceives truth. That others therefore artificially discuss things foreign to the purpose, and why they especially incline to judicial precepts is evident from what has been said. So in that paragraph there, Aristotle gets into some technical language regarding reasoning and making rhetorical arguments. And I recommend you not get too worried about that content, because all that he's really saying is that the art of rhetoric is about learning how to discover proofs, how to gain credibility in your speaking or writing. That's what rhetoric is really about. It's not about these other things. And so what he's really saying to us is, this is what we're going to study in the art of rhetoric. We're not going to get into all of that other stuff. We're not going to talk about how to manipulate judges or to stir up people's affections and try to pervert their judgment. He's saying, no, that stuff doesn't belong to the honest art of rhetoric. What we're going to study is we're going to learn how to discover proofs and make rhetorical arguments. We're going to seek to learn how to obtain credibility. That's the real goal. That's the right goal of the art of rhetoric. And so we're going to unfold all of that as we continue studying this whole work on the art of rhetoric. Now we might wonder, what is the purpose of rhetoric? If we're not trying to manipulate people and make them agree with us or make them judge in our favor, then what's the real purpose of the study of the art of rhetoric? Aristotle goes on and says this: rhetoric is useful because things true and just are naturally more excellent than things that are not true and not just. Rhetoric is useful because things that are true and just are naturally more excellent than things that are not true and not just. So, unless judgments are formed according to what is fit, what is more excellent will be vanquished by its contrary, and this is a thing worthy of reprehension. So what Aristotle says, the usefulness of rhetoric is that we not allow the truth to appear to be defeated by bad arguments or bad speeches. We want to defend the truth effectively, because when we argue for the truth, all we've got to do is present the truth clearly, because the truth will prevail. Most men can discern the truth, and they will see the truth if we present the truth clearly. But if we present the truth poorly, we can give an appearance that the other side is actually right. We can cause the truth to appear to be false, and this is what should concern us. Aristotle says those who do this are worthy of reprehension. And so we want to make sure that we can defend the truth and present the truth clearly, so that we don't give a person who is speaking what's false, who's speaking against the truth, the opportunity to overcome the truth because of our poor presentation and defense of that truth. That's the purpose of the art of rhetoric. The purpose of the art of rhetoric is to enable us to effectively present and defend the truth. Farther still, Aristotle says, though we should possess the most accurate science, it is not easy when we speak to persuade some persons by employing that science. This is an important point. So some people will say something like, the art of rhetoric is the art by which we learn to persuade people. And that is not true. That's not true. Aristotle explains, even though we should possess the most accurate science It is not easy when we speak to persuade some persons. Even if we had the perfect science, even if we did everything right, we still might not persuade a person. And one of the reasons why is because people have free will. Human beings can simply choose to reject even the best arguments. Think about this. There were Jews alive during the time of our Lord who watched him perform miracles that only God could do. And they still did not confess that Jesus was God. Jesus could not have made a more perfect argument. He could not have given any more perfect proof, and the people still rejected him. That teaches us the true purpose of the art of rhetoric. The true purpose is not to make other people agree with us or persuade people, because that's not in our control. The purpose of rhetoric, the true purpose of rhetoric, is for us to accurately or clearly present the truth and defend it. We have a duty to do. We have a duty to the truth. And the purpose of rhetoric is to train ourselves to carry out that duty effectively. He says a scientific oration, a scientific speech, proceeds from discipline or learning, and it is impossible from this to persuade the unlearned. So he gives us an example. If a person is an expert in a certain science, and he's speaking to a crowd of people that are completely unfamiliar with that science, even though he is a master of the science, it's very unlikely that they'll be persuaded by anything he says, because they simply don't know the science. They don't even know if what he's saying is true or false. And so even the most learned expert in a science may not be able to persuade an audience that what he says is true. And that's not his fault. It is necessary, Aristotle says, to procure or obtain credibility. It is necessary to procure credibility and frame arguments from such things as are common. In other words, when our audience changes, we have to know how to argue and present the truth for that audience. So if I'm speaking to an uneducated audience, I can't use arguments that come from the study of all different sciences, because the audience doesn't know those things to be true, and therefore they're not persuasive. So I've got to present and defend the truth in the most effective way possible, and if the audience changes, my method of presenting the truth and defending it has to change to suit the audience. Not that I will persuade the audience, because that's not in my control, but that I will faithfully fulfill my duty to the truth. And Aristotle then says, we have asserted this in the Topics, and the Topics is one of his books that we study in classical reasoning, where he teaches the art of dialectical reasoning. So he says, I explained this in that book, The Topics. Aristotle goes on and continues talking about the usefulness of the art of rhetoric, and he says, farther still, the power of being able to persuade contraries, the ability of disputing on each side of a question is necessary in the same manner as in syllogisms, not in order that we may actually do both, for it is not proper to persuade to what is base, but that we may not be ignorant how contraries subsist, and that when another person employs those arguments unjustly, we may be able to solve them. So another reason Aristotle gives for the usefulness, or another argument he gives for the usefulness of the study of the art of rhetoric, is that we want to develop the ability to argue both sides of every issue. We don't want to practice and practice and practice only arguing our side or our opinions on different topics, but we want to exercise ourselves in arguing both sides of the issues. And we normally don't do that, as you know. So as a Catholic, we know that it's important for us to practice, to study and practice arguing, to present the truths of Catholicism clearly and defend them. But we also should exercise ourselves in arguing that Catholicism is false. And the reason why we do that is to become familiar with the arguments, to really test our ability to defend and explain the Catholic faith, to put our own reasoning to the test and prepare ourselves for the kinds of objections and arguments that other people are going to make against us. So it's good exercise for us to practice arguing on both sides of a question. And we do this as we study and practice the art of rhetoric. Aristotle says, now, I'm not saying that because I want you to develop the skill to argue on both sides of the issue and then actually go do that, because that would be unjust. You're only to argue for the truth. And so we can imagine some professional speaker who's willing to say whatever you want him to say in exchange for a paycheck. And so he practices arguing all different positions on different issues, and he's willing to say whatever the person who pays him wants him to say. Aristotle's saying, no, you can never do that. You always have to argue for the truth. But it's good exercise to practice arguing both sides of the issue. No one of the other arts syllogistically concludes contraries. No other arts do this. This is alone effected by dialectic and rhetoric. For both of them are similarly conversant with contraries, though the things which are the subjects of their consideration do not subsist similarly, but always, as I may say, things which are true and naturally more excellent are more syllogistic and adapted to procure persuasion. So this is an encouragement. Aristotle's telling us, if you're a person who's honest and good and you want to argue and defend the truth, you've got the easier job, because the truth is easier to argue. And I mentioned before the saying, the truth will prevail. You know how hard it is from your own experience to defend a lie. It's very difficult to defend what's false. And so if you make sure that you're always arguing for the truth, you'll find that you have the easier job than those who are arguing against the truth. And that should be encouraging to us. Besides, he says, it is absurd that it should be shameful for a man not to be able to give assistance to his body, and that it should not be shameful for him to not be able to assist himself by the reasoning power, which is more the peculiarity of man than the use of the body. In other words, just as we would strengthen our body so that we can do more work, in the study of rhetoric, we're learning to develop our reasoning ability so that we can more effectively present and defend the truth. There's nothing shameful or to be embarrassed by about that. It's normal. We do this for the sake of our body all the time. How much more so should we do it for the sake of our reasoning power and for our life as regards truth and falsehood? If it should be objected that he who uses unjustly the rhetorical power may injure others in a great degree, this objection is common to everything that is good. So some may say, well, I don't think we should study rhetoric because it can be used to do harm to others. Well, Aristotle's answer is that could be said of anything that's good. So that's really not a good objection to the study of rhetoric. He then says, he who uses things of this kind justly may benefit others in the greatest degree, and by using them unjustly may effect the greatest injury. It's not the art of rhetoric that does that evil, it's the individual person. So don't blame rhetoric, because some people will abuse it. At the same time, I would argue that rhetoric also protects us from men who would misuse rhetoric. And that's another reason why it's important to study. Aristotle goes on and says that rhetoric, therefore, is not conversant with one certain definite genus or class of study, but resembles in this respect dialectic, and that it is useful is evident. We've already proven that, and we can understand why it's helpful very easily. It is likewise evident that the employment of rhetoric is not to persuade, but to perceive on every subject what is adapted to procure persuasion in the same manner as in all other arts. So there in that sentence, you've got this important statement of the true purpose of the art of rhetoric. The employment of rhetoric is not to persuade, but to perceive on every subject what is adapted to procure persuasion. And that's a mouthful and some difficult language, but what Aristotle is saying is that the goal of rhetoric is not to persuade people. The goal of rhetoric is to understand how you can procure credibility. That is, how you can discover good arguments or proofs on any subject. That's the goal of the study of the art of rhetoric. And Aristotle provides us with a helpful comparison here, comparing rhetoric to medicine and showing us that what the doctor does in medicine is like what the rhetorician does. He says, "It is not the business of medicine to produce health." That may be strange to hear. It's not the business of medicine to produce health. And why would that be? Because it's not in the power of a doctor to make a person healthy. If a person has a disease and God wills that that person not recover from that disease, there's nothing that anyone can do to save that person's life or to make that person better. It's not in the power of a physician to heal a disease or to make a person healthy. What the business of medicine is, Aristotle says, is to do everything as much as possible that may procure health. So the art of medicine is the art by which a physician seeks to do everything possible to bring the patient back to health. But to actually bring the patient back to health is not in the physician's power and is therefore not the goal of the art of medicine. Aristotle says the healing art, the art of medicine, may be well exercised upon those that are incapable of being restored to health. The doctor may do everything that he should have done and the person simply not recover. In addition, likewise to what has been said, it is the province of the same power to perceive what is persuasive. That is, a rhetorician who's expected to be a reasonable person. He seeks, through the study and use of rhetoric, to identify what is persuasive and what appears to be persuasive. And that's important, an important distinction Aristotle makes. There are things that are truly reasonable and persuasive, and there are other things that appear to be persuasive, but are not necessarily so. Just as it is in the province of dialectic to discern what is a true and what is only an apparent syllogism. Remember, syllogism means an argument. So there are some arguments that appear to be true, but actually are not true. And then there are syllogisms that actually are true arguments. The sophistical art The sophistical art, that means the art of the deceiver, the art of one who abuses rhetoric and reasoning to try and trick people and mislead people, the sophistical art. It's important to know that St. Ignatius of Loyola said that the devil is a sophist. He's a deceiver. He uses these arts to trick men and lead them into error. The sophistical art does not consist in the power of reasoning, but in deliberate choice, that is, just influencing the decisions of men. Except that here indeed, namely in the rhetorical art, one man will be a rhetorician from science, but another from deliberate choice. There, however, namely in dialectic, the sophist indeed is from deliberate choice, but the logician is not from deliberate choice, but from the power of reasoning, that is, the true power of reasoning. The sophist presents himself as one who makes use of reason, as one who is reasonable. But what he's actually doing is misleading people that he speaks to and deceiving them and leading them to make a false choice, because our choices are based on much more than just reason. They're also based on our desires or our belief about what will happen as a result of a decision. So the sophist is seeking to manipulate people's decisions, whereas the true rhetorician is actually seeking out what is reasonable and both presenting the truth and defending it as effectively and honestly as possible. And that brings us to the end of chapter 1. So we've made our first reading through chapter 1. I congratulate you if you followed along with me. The purpose of that walk through the chapter is just to introduce you to the content, to help you become familiar with what you need to study on your own, and prepare you now to go back and reread that chapter for yourself and study it really carefully. Make sure you pay attention to technical terms and vocabulary that you're not familiar with. Jot those words down and look them up in the Oxford English Dictionary. Go through, make sure you understand every sentence, every paragraph, all the concepts. If you have any questions about the lesson, post your questions on the student forum on the Rhetoric course page, and study this chapter for mastery following the instructions in the article How to Study for Mastery, and then complete the lesson assessment when you're ready to do so. So I hope that that's a helpful introduction to this lesson. Good luck with your own study, and I look forward to seeing your written assessment or quiz, whatever is on this lesson, to see how you do. God bless your studies.